In the long centuries of Imperial China, the pursuit of truth in a courtroom was often measured not by fairness or reason, but by endurance. How much agony the accused could withstand before words of guilt were forced from their lips. Among the tools designed for this grim process were two infamous instruments: the Zanzhi, a device meant to crush fingers, and the jiagun, a heavy press that inflicted unbearable pain on the feet or ankles. These tools were not hidden implements of cruelty used in secret chambers. They were official instruments sanctioned by law, wielded openly in courtrooms as extensions of the state's authority. To understand them is to understand how law and torture were woven together. How confession was not proof of guilt, but the inevitable product of pain. The Zanzhi was deceptively simple. It consisted of a set of slender sticks or rods, often made of hardwood or sometimes bamboo, which were placed around a person's fingers. These sticks were tied together with cords and then twisted tighter and tighter, until the pressure caused the bones and flesh of the fingers to crush together. The pain was immediate and excruciating, escalating with every turn of the cord. Victims could feel cartilage snap, nails split, and blood vessels burst under the mounting pressure. It was a device built not to kill but to break the will. The fingers, delicate and sensitive, became conduits of unimaginable torment, and with each twist, words of confession became harder to resist. The jiagun, by contrast, targeted the feet and ankles. It was usually a large wooden frame with heavy boards or beams placed around the lower legs. The accused would be forced to sit or kneel, their ankles trapped between planks, and then pressure was applied by hammering wedges or tightening screws, until the bones of the feet cracked under the weight. The jiagun could be adjusted. Sometimes the pressure was incremental, designed to wear down resistance slowly. Other times, the force was sudden and overwhelming, shattering bone and ligament in one brutal application. The symbolism of targeting the feet was significant. The feet carried the body, the means of standing and moving. To destroy them was to reduce a person to immobility, to strip them of dignity and independence even if they survived. These devices were not curiosities locked away in museums. They were embedded into the very structure of justice. Under imperial law, torture was considered a legitimate tool of inquiry, particularly when evidence was scarce or when testimony was disputed. Confession was seen as the ultimate proof of guilt, and if it could not be obtained freely, it was drawn out by force. Judges and magistrates were expected to balance their use of torture with certain legal constraints. Official statutes stated that torture should be applied progressively and proportionately, and only when lesser measures had failed. Yet in practice, these words were thin shields against suffering. Once a case reached the stage where Xanzi or Giagon were used, it was rare for an accused person to escape without confession, truthful or not. Women were especially vulnerable in cases of adultery, theft, or witchcraft. They were often subjected to Zanzhi, their fingers crushed until they admitted to whatever the magistrate demanded. Testimonies recorded from local gazettes and casebooks describe women who could no longer sew, weave, or work after enduring these punishments, their hands permanently damaged. Men, especially those accused of banditry or violent crimes, were often subjected to the jiagun. The destruction of their feet made them unable to walk, sometimes crippling them for life. The suffering inflicted was not merely temporary. It lingered long after the courtroom closed, binding victims to a lifetime of pain even if they were acquitted. One chilling testimony preserved in Qing Dynasty records describes a woman accused of poisoning her neighbor, with no witnesses and little evidence. She was brought before the magistrate and subjected to the Zanzhi. Her fingers were bound and the cords twisted, each turn punctuated by her screams. At first, she denied the charge. With every tightening, the magistrate pressed her, "Confess, and the pain will stop." By the time the rods had nearly shattered her fingers, she confessed to the crime. Yet, historians suggest her confession was less about guilt than about escape from a torment her body could no longer endure. Another record from the late Ming Dynasty tells of a man accused of conspiring with rebels. He was forced into the jiagun, his ankles trapped between thick beams. As the wedges were hammered in, the bones cracked audibly. He shouted that he was innocent. But the agony grew, until his words faltered. By the end of the session, he could no longer walk. He confessed to conspiracy, though no evidence was ever produced against him. The confession itself became the proof, the torture the path by which guilt was manufactured. What is striking about these accounts is not only the cruelty, but the open acknowledgement of these devices as part of the justice system. Court records often noted the use of Xanzi and Giagon as if they were routine legal procedures. Like calling witnesses or reading documents, torture was bureaucratized, codified into law, and accepted as a necessary evil of governance. Officials were even trained in how to administer it properly, advised to avoid killing the accused too quickly so that testimony could be extracted fully. Yet behind the neat records lay the shattered lives of the accused. The law, for all its formality, did not protect them from irreversible damage. Some lost their ability to work, others lived with twisted hands or crippled feet, their bodies silent testaments. To a justice system that prized confession over truth, families bore the burden too, as mutilated relatives could no longer provide or participate in daily life. Torture did not end with the courtroom. It echoed into homes, livelihoods, and communities. The Xanzi and Giagon were not the only devices used in China's long history of judicial torture, but they were perhaps among the most personal. They attacked the extremities, the fingers that touched, the feet that carried, turning the body itself into the battlefield of power. To understand their use is to see how imperial justice weaponized pain, bending not just the body but the spirit. The legacy of these tools reminds us that behind every confession extracted by force was a human being, broken by design. The legacy of these tools reminds us that behind every confession extracted by force was a human being, broken by design. The system that embraced devices like the Zanzhi and Giagon was not simply interested in truth. It was interested in obedience. The use of pain as a language of authority meant that silence was no longer an option. You either spoke or your body spoke for you. Testimonies recorded in official court documents paint a chilling picture. Some describe the sound of fingers snapping under the Zanzhi as loud as branches breaking underfoot. Others recalled the unbearable ache of bones in the foot as the jiagun pressed down, grinding joints until they shattered. These were not just passing sensations but permanent mutilations. Even if a victim survived the torture, the damage often lingered for life. Fingers twisted, toes crushed flat, bones never healing correctly. In an empire that depended heavily on labor, where survival depended on the use of one's hands and feet, the destruction of these body parts was as much a social death as a physical one. Women accused of adultery or infidelity were particularly vulnerable to these punishments. Historical archives mention multiple cases in which wives were subjected to the Zanzhi, their fingers crushed until they confessed to crimes of betrayal. In patriarchal courts, their cries were dismissed as weakness, their confessions accepted as truth, even when they were simply the result of unbearable suffering. Men accused of theft or rebellion often met the jiagun. Their feet, once instruments of mobility and freedom, were destroyed in minutes, ensuring that even if they lived, they would walk the rest of their lives in agony. The symbolism was sharp. Hands represented action, the ability to touch and control the world. Feet represented movement, the ability to escape or rebel. By crushing fingers and feet, the empire was making a statement. Your hands belong to us. Your feet cannot carry you away. These tools were not only physical punishments but instruments of domination that erased independence. Some of the most horrifying aspects of the Zanzhi and Giagon were how methodical their use became. Manuals and legal instructions actually outline how many turns of the screw or how much pressure should be applied before a confession could be considered valid. There was a perverse science to the cruelty. Too little pressure and the accused might resist. Too much pressure and death could arrive before words were extracted. The art of torture was balanced carefully between inflicting unbearable agony and preserving the victim long enough to speak. It was pain engineered into law. The physical pain was only half of the story. The psychological torment of awaiting these punishments was equally devastating. Prisoners would hear the sounds of others being tortured, the sharp cracks of bones, the guttural screams echoing through the halls. In some cases, victims confessed before the device even touched them, their minds breaking under anticipation alone. The tools did not need to be applied to work. Sometimes the threat was enough. Fear itself became an invisible chain, binding countless accused individuals into compliance. But even with this efficiency, there were limits. Not every confession extracted was the truth, and not every victim was guilty. Historians and legal scholars point out that countless innocent men and women admitted to crimes they never committed, simply to stop the torture. This made the Xanzi and Giagon double-edged weapons. They provided the illusion of justice, but in reality, they only produced stories of agony dressed as truth. The cost of maintaining order was measured in shattered bodies and silenced voices. By the late Qing dynasty, criticism of such brutal methods began to grow louder. Intellectuals and reformers began to question whether the pursuit of confessions through suffering truly upheld justice or whether it corrupted it entirely. They argued that a confession given under duress was worthless, a hollow echo of truth drowned by screams. This marked the beginning of a slow decline in the use of such torture devices. Though their shadows remained etched in history, the story of Xanzi and Giagon reveals something profound about the human condition. How fragile the boundary is between justice and cruelty. How easily systems of power can turn tools of inquiry into instruments of horror. For the officials who turned the screws, the act was mechanical, part of their duty. For the accused, it was the collapse of their world, the moment when their bodies betrayed them. Each crushed finger, each shattered foot, is a reminder that law without compassion becomes nothing more than another form of violence. What makes this history especially haunting is how familiar it feels even today. Though the Zanzhi and Giagon belong to Imperial China, the idea of coercion through pain still lingers in modern debates over justice and human rights. The question remains the same. How far should authority go in the pursuit of truth? And at what point does truth extracted by agony cease to be truth at all? In the dark halls of Chinese prisons centuries ago, victims screamed as their fingers bent unnaturally and their bones crumbled under steel and wood. Those screams have long since faded, but the echoes remain. They remind us that justice should never be built on suffering. The truth born of agony is no truth at all. The Zanzhi and Giagon were simple devices, no larger than the tools of a carpenter or a farmer. But in the wrong hands, they became symbols of a state's power to crush not only bodies but spirits. They remind us how easily human invention, when paired with cruelty, can transform ordinary objects into nightmares. And that is why their story must be told not just as relics of the past, but as warnings for the future. Because every time humanity forgets the lessons carved into the bones of victims, history risks repeating itself in new and terrifying forms. If this story unsettled you, if the cruelty of the Zanzhi and Giagon opened your eyes to the darker corners of history, then stay with us. On this channel, we uncover the buried truths, the stories of pain and power that shape the world in ways often forgotten. Subscribe, share, and keep exploring with us. Because only by remembering can we prevent the tools of torture from ever returning.